Welcome to Excel Magic Trick number 1341. Hey, if you want to download this Excel file, either the finished file or the start file so you can follow along, click on the link below the video. Wow, we got a great video here. We need to calculate standard deviation with conditions or criteria, and we're going to see how to do it with Power Query Pivot Table and an array formula. Now, this is the finished file. Here's formula, pivot table, and Power Query. Each one has advantages and disadvantages, and we'll see how to do all three. Now, here's the setup. We actually have a column with product, region, and units. So right here, when we're calculating average and standard deviation, we're not making the calculation on all the numbers, but instead just some of the numbers. Now for this row right here, we need to find only the records that contain Belen and East. So for that first calculation, we would actually only need these four records, and actually only those four units would be used to calculate average and standard deviation. Now, standard deviation, if you don't know what it is, I have an epic video here from my statistics series that you can go watch and learn all about standard deviation. Now, let's go over to our start file, and we're going to start off with formulas. The advantage to using formulas is any formula will update instantly when the source numbers change. The disadvantage to formulas, the formulas are actually harder to create, in particular when compared to pivot tables. And if criteria is added, meaning we added a different region or product, we'd actually have to come and modify the report instead of a simple refresh like pivot table or Power Query. All right, if we're calculating average, for this row, we're going to have the condition, is it Belen in the product column, and is it East in the region column? Well, for average calculation with conditions or criteria, there's a great built-in function, average ifs. Now, if you've used SUMIFs or COUNTIFs, then you already know how to use this function. Average range, that's the first argument. We need to give it all of the numbers. Now, when I highlight this column, you'll see that I'm using the table feature here. So that's table formula nomenclature. That's the table name, and then field name in square brackets. All right, comma. We have two conditions or criteria, so we're going to start with criteria range 1. When you see the word range, that means you highlight the entire column. That's the product column. Now, when I type a comma, now it says criteria 1. That's the individual criteria. So I click on Belen. And that's a relative cell reference, so when I copy down, that will work perfect. Comma. Criteria range 2, the entire region column. There's our region column. Comma. Criteria 2, I simply click on relative cell reference for region East, and there we go. That formula is done. Now, I want you to notice something about this average ifs. Now, remember, there's COUNTIFs and SUMIFs, and they all work the same. We put in all the numbers, then we put the first column and the criteria for that column, second column, criteria. Now, when we get over to standard deviation, it's going to be slightly different. Nevertheless, Control-Enter, and there it is, the calculation. Now, I actually already added number formatting. If I Control-1, you can see I've added number with no decimal showing. Click OK. Now I can double-click and send it down, go to the last cell and hit F2 to check it. All the cell references and table formula nomenclature references are looking good. All right, let's calculate standard deviation. And this is from a sample, so we're going to use standard deviation dot S. Now, I would like to use standard deviation dot S with an if, just like average if, SUMIFs, COUNTIFs. But that function is not in Excel. There's no such thing. So we just use the straight aggregate function, and in the number argument, instead of putting all of the numbers, we're actually going to use the if function to filter out and get just the numbers we want. So in the number one argument, I'm going to put the if function. Now, the if function in the logical test will allow us to do what's called an array calculation. I'm going to highlight the entire product column. And instead of comma criteria, I have to say, hey, is anything in that column equal to my condition or criteria? Now, if I click on this logical test and hit the F9 key, you can see it gives me a bunch of trues and falses. Those trues and falses will help us to pick out just the numbers we want for our calculation. Now, I evaluated that with F9, so I'm going to Control Z to undo that. All right, comma. We have a second condition, so we have to put in the value of true, we have to put a second if function. We're nesting two ifs together because we have two conditions. Logical test, I simply highlight region. And I ask the question, are any of you equal to the East as a relative cell reference? And if we evaluated that, it would give us the trues and falses for the East records. But now we want to comma and get to value if true. This is where we put the entire column of numbers. There it is, F product sale units. Now we want to leave the false out, because if we leave that out, it will inject falses into our resultant array, and the falses will be our filter to filter out the unit numbers we don't want. So we put close parentheses, and we have to put a second close parentheses because we had two ifs. Now notice right there, I clicked on number one. That's the entire if, condition, condition, numbers. If I hit the F9 key to evaluate, boom, it gives us just the numbers we want that we can dump into the standard deviation function. The falses will be ignored. All aggregate functions can do this type of if array because all aggregate functions ignore those falses. Now I'm going to Control Z, come to the end, close parentheses. Now this is a special type of array calculation, and this argument that contains that array operation will not calculate correctly unless we tell Excel that this is an array formula. And we do that by entering the formula with the keystrokes Control, Shift, and Enter. Instantly after we do Control, Shift, Enter, you got to go up to the formula bar and verify that those curly brackets are put in. Those curly brackets are Excel telling you it understood that this was an array formula and calculated it correctly. Now we can double click and send it down. Now I'm going to go to the last cell and hit the F2 key to verify that all the references are correct. Now, I don't want to hit Enter here because I had to enter it with Control Shift Enter. I could use Control Shift Enter, but instead I'm going to Escape, which reverts back to whatever the formula was in the cell before I put it in edit mode. Escape. So that's the formula method. And if I was to come up here and change one of the numbers, 100, before I hit Enter, watch what happens. When I hit Enter, instantly this updates. That's the main advantage for formulas. Now I'm going to Control Z to undo that. Now, let's see the pivot table method. And the pivot table method is by far the easiest method. I'm going to click in a single cell, go up to Insert, Pivot Table, or I'm going to use the keyboard Alt-N-V. It got the name of the table. We want to come down here, and I'm going to put this on this existing sheet location. And I'm going to live dangerously here. I'm putting it close to other things, but that will be OK. I'm going to click OK. Here's our field list. And watch this. Notice for our formulas, we had a list of our products and regions. Now, we actually had to type that out and figure that out. The pivot table will do all of this automatically. I'm going to drag product down to the rows, and instantly we get a unique list of products from the product column. Now I'm going to drag region below products. Instantly we get Belen and then East-West, Carlota, East-West. Now I want to actually change this to make it look more like this up here. So I'm going to do a couple things. I'm going to come up to Design, report layout, and I want to say show in tabular. That will give me the actual names of the fields and break this apart into two columns. Now, I don't want grand total, so I come up to grand totals, off for rows and columns. I'm actually going to end up not wanting that subtotal right there either, so I go up to subtotal, do not show. I do not want those collapse buttons, so I'm going to right-click Pivot Table Options. And on the Display tab, I'm going to uncheck Show Expand Collapse buttons. Finally, I want to list the product names all the way down. So I come back up to Report Layout and repeat all item labels. And there we go. Now I'm going to drag units down to values. Units down to values a second time. Now, I do not want the aggregate calculation sum in either column. So I'm going to click somewhere in this one column, right-click down to Summarize Values By, and there's my average. I want to display this with 0 decimals, so right-click one cell in this column. I do not want Format Cells. That's for cells. I want number formatting. That will format the field in this pivot table. Number, 0 decimals. Click OK. Now I come over, right-click, Summarize Values By. Oh, no, I'm looking for standard deviation. I don't see it, but no problem. More options. This actually opens up the Value Field Settings dialog box. And down here, 11 functions to choose from. There's my standard deviation for the sample. And while I'm here, I'm going to click Number Formatting. That's another way to get to the number formatting for the field. And actually, I want just number with 2 decimals. Click OK. Click OK. Now, I actually should have changed the title while I was down there, but I'm going to click in the cell and type standard deviation and enter. Now, you notice that this column up here was the correct width before I made this pivot table. And this pivot table kept changing the column width. So I'm going to change one other setting. Right-click, Pivot Table Options. And on the Layout and Format, I'm going to say Uncheck Auto Format Column Widths and click OK. All right, I'm going to click here, F2, and then edit this. Get rid of units and enter. So there it is with a pivot table. Now, the amazing thing about a pivot table is if I was to come down to the bottom, and this is an Excel table, which is a single object that the pivot table is looking at. So I can add a record here. If I type a new product, Aspen, tab, West, tab, 100, tab, and then add a new record, Aspen, West. And both were 100, which means the standard deviation will be 0. Now, before I come over here and right-click refresh, let's just see what happens over here if I change this to 100. Remember, we said the advantage to the formula was if the numbers change but not the criteria, instantly it updates. But now, let's right-click in this pivot table and notice when I refresh, not only does it get the number, but it also incorporates any new conditions or criteria. That is pretty amazing. I would have to come up here and actually type out Aspen West and then copy these formulas down. Now, when we're using Power Query, I am going to reference this table and make our calculations. But if the data is already here, I probably would use the pivot table because it's the easiest if I didn't mind refreshing. If I didn't ever want to refresh, then I would stick with formulas. But I'm going to show you Power Query from this table here. But really, the main advantage of Power Query is if the data is coming externally. And I have lots of videos that show how to get data externally using Power Query, and it really is quite amazing. All right, let's click in a single cell. And if I'm going to use Power Query, I'm in Excel 2016, so I go to the Data Ribbon tab, and it's built right in. Get and Transform is Power Query. If you're in Excel 2013 or 2010, you have to download it and install an extra tab called Power Query. All right, this is an Excel table, so I click From Table. And we're actually going to see two methods for creating this report using Power Query. Now here's 1, 2, 3 columns. I'm going to immediately come over and name this. I called it Product Av and Standard Deviation Report 1. Now notice it already did 2 steps. It went and got from our source, which is an Excel table, and it changed the data types. You can see the data types right here, ABC. ABC, that means these are text columns. And that's 1, 2, 3, which means this is whole numbers. Now, how do we make aggregate calculations with conditions or criteria in Power Query? Well, we use the Group By feature. Now, we Excel people can think of Group By like a pivot table or count ifs, sum ifs, average ifs. We're making some calculation with conditions or criteria. If you're a database person or you type SQL, you know Group By as the feature that will group together a particular set of records and then make calculations or do other things. Now, if we're going to use Group By and we have 2 conditions, we click on the first. And then before clicking on the second, I'm going to hold Shift. By highlighting both of these columns, it will look through these 2 columns and get a unique list, meaning it will get 1 Belen East and 1 Belen West, and so on. And then we can make our calculation. We come up with those 2 columns selected and click Group By. It already has the 2 fields that we need to get a unique list from. We come down here, and the first name for our column will be Average. Now we come up to Operations, and we click Average. Over to Column, and the operation, meaning the average calculation, will be made on the Units column. Now we come down to Add Aggregation. And I'm going to hopefully call this Standard Deviation. And I'm going to come over to the drop-down for our operation and look for Standard Deviation. What? You got to be kidding me. 7 calculations? Over in the pivot table, there's 11 calculations. Where is standard deviation? I have no idea why they don't have that here. All right, for our first example, we're going to use all rows. It will look through the entire data set and get all of the records for each one of the unique items from these 2 columns. There's nothing here because when we use all rows, it simply gets all the rows for these 2 columns. Now I'm going to click OK. And look at that. There's our unique list for each one of our 2 columns. There's the average calculation. But boom, we're going to have to add an extra column. Now, I did it the long way this time because we can actually click in each one of these tables that are returned and look down here. There are all the records for Carlota East, and there's the units. Now, when we add our extra column, we're going to actually have to refer to this column standard deviation. And since each one of these is a table, we don't want everything. We want just the units column. So we'll remember that when we create our extra column. Now we can go up to Add a Column, Add Custom Column. Our new column name, I'm simply going to call it SD for standard deviation. And, well, wait a second. We have to know the function. So, of course, we went to Google and said Power Query Standard Deviation Function. And this is what it said. It is a list function, dot, and then we type standard deviation. Now, it's very important with Power Query functions, of course, that we spell it correctly just like over in Excel, but also that the case is correct. So hopefully I spelled it right. Now, we need to reference standard deviation, so I'm simply going to double-click this. That won't work. We need to indicate to the list function a single vertical column. So in square brackets, I type units, close square brackets. And that will calculate standard deviation. Close parentheses, click OK, and boom, there it is. Now, for this report, we're not going to need this column, so right-click Remove. Notice our list of applied steps are accumulating all of our steps. So when we refresh, it knows to go through all of these steps. I'm actually going to double-click and call this standard deviation, and enter. Now, notice that icon. It says ABC123. That means it doesn't know what data type this is. Now, instead of going up to transform and using data type dropdown or over to home data type dropdown, I learned this great trick from one of the comments at YouTube. I think it was DR Steele who said this. Hey, just click the icon and boom, our list of data types come up. I'm going to click decimal. Now I want to bring this back to Excel. So home, close and load to. Definitely want it as a table on this existing worksheet. Click the collapse button, and I'm going to live dangerously. I'm going to try and click J12. Click OK. Click load. Now I'm immediately going to come over here and highlight the average column and Control 1, number, 0 decimal places. Click OK. Highlight, Control 1, number, and 2 is fine. Click OK. Now with this first method, we explicitly listed the table for each grouping category and then built an extra column for our list.standarddeviation function. Now, if you want to use the user interface, that's a good solution. But if you don't mind messing around with the M code behind the scenes, there's a much easier way to do this. I'm going to click in a single cell, data from table, or I'm going to use the keyboard Alt-A-P-T. I'm immediately going to come over and name this product av and standard deviation report 2 and enter. I'm going to highlight the first 2 columns, hold shift, click on region, home ribbon, group by. There's the 2 columns that will give us a unique list. The column name for our first aggregate calculation will be average. Our operation or function will be average. The column we're going to calculate that aggregate calculation on is units. Now I'm going to cheat. I'm going to come down here. I'm going to type standard deviation and come over here. And this is a total cheat. I'm going to do 2 calculations on average. I'm hoping that by giving it a column title of standard deviation, it'll just know to do it. It won't, but we'll fix it. Come over here, and I want to calculate upon the units column. Now I can click OK. What? The standard deviation is the same as the average. Yes, that is possible, but in this case, it is not correct. Well, we're going to go up to View, over to Advanced Editor, and here is our M code. I'm going to expand this. Our M code will always start with let, and then there's each one of our steps. It will say in and list the last step. We can see we got our source from the current workbook, and there's our table name. The change type, change the type as an automatic step. And here's the step we did, group rows. Well, it used the table.group function. It always has to list the name of the previous step, which in essence is our table. The second argument is always the columns we want to group by. Now, when you see curly brackets in Power Query, it means that this is a list. And it is. It's a list of the 2 columns we want to group by. The third argument is our aggregate calculation. And it also is listed as a list because we have multiple calculations here. This is actually a list within a list. The outer list is telling us the 2 aggregate calculation. And then the inner list, this first one right here before the comma, is information about that aggregate calculation. The average in double quotes is the name we gave it at each. And here's the function. Look at that. List.average and then units. The third argument is the type, and it is type number. So look at this. We're going to totally cheat. We're going to come over to the second one, which is not right, and simply change average to standard deviation. And there it is, the list.standarddeviation function that we had to use in our last Power Query example as an extra column. We're just typing it right in. And there you go. When we click Done, boom, there it is. Now we can go to Home, Close and Load, Close and Load to Table, Existing, Collapse, somewhere like J23, and click OK. Click Load. Control 1, number 0 decimals, OK. Highlight Control 1, number, click OK. Our second method for Power Query. Now let's test this. I'm going to come up to this first record, 74. Of course, when I hit Enter, Formulas Update, none of these updated. But now I'm going to come down to the bottom, add another record for Aspen. All right, now I'm going to use the keyboard for Refresh All, Control Alt F5. And look at that. There's our pivot table totally updating. Of course, our formulas didn't because we didn't change the structure the first time we encountered that. And our two Power Query outputs update perfectly. All right, that was a lot of fun with array formulas, pivot tables, and two methods for Power Query for calculating average and standard deviation with two conditions or criteria. All right, we'll see you next trick.